The first people that called Indiana home lived here thousands of years ago. This was long before any Europeans stepped foot in Indiana. We can learn a lot about the Native Americans, how they lived, and their continued and lasting impact on our state. Michelle Greenan, our Director of Archaeology, will share more about Native American history.
Native Americans were the first people to live in Indiana, but really who I'm talking about are the ancestors of today's Native American people. So these First Nations began living in Indiana at least 12,000 years ago, and perhaps longer. So for a little comparison, we're talking about a time long before the pyramids were built, so even older than your parents. So this was a time the last ice age was coming to a close, but the environment was cooler and different than what we would recognize today. Unfortunately, archaeology is really limited in many ways because it can only use those artifacts that are left behind. So things like stone and some ceramics preserve really well, but other things like textiles, cloth, pretty much everything else doesn't preserve. So archaeologists are left with just a smidgen, really, of what people were using. So take myself, for example. My clothes, everything I'm wearing, maybe my earrings made of stone would actually preserve. And what could an archaeologist tell about me based on just my earrings? So an archaeologist tries to piece together as much evidence as possible from different places to put together a really comprehensive picture. One bit of evidence that archaeologists can use to address where and how people lived is changes in the soil. When you dig in the ground and then fill it back in, or say dig out a trench to place posts for a house, changes in the soil can be seen by archaeologists. This lets us identify houses and other structures once built on the landscape. So archaeologists can also see charred, burned material. So we can often find nice big pits where people were cooking and maybe storing food. So these are all the bits of evidence that archaeologists can put together. Native American communities lived in Indiana for thousands and thousands of years. So over those many millennia, communities changed as they developed new technologies to meet whatever challenges that they were up against. So at times, hundreds, even thousands of people were part of large towns, larger than any towns you would see in Europe or many other places. So at others, communities were smaller, finely tuned communities so that they could live how they wanted to live. So at any given time, diverse communities, likely speaking different languages, lived in different areas of the state. So when we think about Native American communities that we see in the archaeological record, when we think of those communities of the course of those thousands of years, we have to remember time and how diverse those communities were. So archaeologists can know all sorts of things, types of houses, what other structures people were building, what people were eating, how they were hunting and making art. If you kind of put all these pieces together, you can start thinking about bigger questions like politics, how did they govern themselves? And economy, what kind of trade did they enjoy? What did they do to make a living? My favorite thing in archaeology, in this gallery, in this First Nation gallery right here, is a Yankee Town Pot. So it was found at an archaeological site in southwestern Indiana. And it's one of my favorites. I helped to find it. That's definitely one reason. It shows a lot of things to archaeologists. So it's very large, it's huge, and it has this lovely scouring in the bottom where you can see that people were scouring away using this vessel made of ceramic over and over again. And what's really kind of neat is that this community was one of the first communities to use corn in a big part of their diet. So what they were doing was probably making corn cakes, making all kinds of wonderful culinary dishes, and this pot was part of that. So one of the most important lessons that archaeologists are working with is to look at Native American communities today and work closely with those communities so we can better interpret what's happening. So these artifacts are only one piece of the story, but those artifacts are living, they're breathing in Native American communities today. And only through listening to their stories and their histories can we really start telling this important history of the First Nations.